The Australia Together podcast is brought to you by Australian Community Futures Planning, Australia's first community-based research and planning entity organising to involve Australians in planning a better future for themselves and for future generations. Find out everything about ACFP and how to become involved at www.austcfp.com.au. ACFP acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as first Australians and recognises their culture, history, diversity and their abiding connection with the land. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and fully acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. The Australia Together podcast is recorded on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. In February 2023, Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers released an essay on the economy called Capitalism After the Crises. A few months before that, he also expressed a desire to have a conversation with the Australian people about how we pay for the services that they need and deserve and have a right to expect. In this essay, ACFP's founder Bronwyn Kelly replies to the Treasurer and offers some ideas about how Australians may participate in conversations with the government, not just about how they might pay for the services they deserve, but also how their values might influence the shape of Australia's next economy. This essay is being delivered in 4 parts. In Part 1, Bronwyn discussed Chalmers' commitment to hold conversations on the economy and suggested that Australians should chime in. She outlined 3 priority conversations that should be established between the government and Australians at large if we are to succeed as a nation in building the sort of economy the government wants, one that promotes inclusion, equality, and the values of Australians. The 3 suggested conversations are about a values-based economy, a competitive economy, and a fair economy. In Part 2, Bronwyn covered how the government can have conversations with the Australian people about how to establish a values-based economy. She suggested that a critical conversation for the success of such an ambitious project is to ask Australians what they value. This option would add something to the Treasurer's optimism that will help the government sidestep the clear weaknesses of his proposal to remake the Australian economy, a strategy which relies far too little on restoring competition so that business has sufficient incentive to behave well as a responsible partner in meeting national goals. In Part 3 of her talk, Bronwyn turns to the issue of how neoliberalism has made Australia's economy less competitive than it needs to be if we are to reverse trends of inequality and exclusion. She outlines the need for a conversation on what it will really take to restore a competitive economy, suggesting that this will require greater public sector participation in direct delivery of services and ownership of infrastructure in strong competition with the private sector, and greater courage by the government to advocate on behalf of Australians in tough conversations with business. For a full transcript of this talk, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au/national-wellbeing-index or follow the link below.
In his essay, Capitalism After the Crises, Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers has imagined a new type of capitalism which puts the values of people at the centre of our economy, and he has suggested that the best way to ensure that capitalism delivers what Australians value is to build markets as partnerships between business, labour and government. The emphasis of his strategy is to change the decision systems governments use in economic matters so that we shift the private sector investments in Australia towards those that will provide public value. He is committing to introducing a new relationship of collaboration and co-investment between government and the private sector. But when we look at both the evidence of risk associated with excessive reliance on partnerships between business and government and the evidence about what Australians value for the future, This strongly suggests that Australians want and need more surety about essential services than has been and can be provided by forms of capitalism like neoliberalism, which rely too heavily on private domination of markets and too little on public sector participation. Given that evidence, one major policy option that should strengthen our capacity to deliver the well-being and security that Australians need would be to revise the national competition policy. The Albanese government, in some sense, is considering this, having appointed Andrew Leigh as Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury. But it would appear that the impetus of reforms is not towards increasing competition by ensuring the publicly owned sector restores and maintains a solid share in the market, a share sufficient to ensure that there is enough competition to the private sector to keep it competition fit, and therefore keep it efficient enough so that it lives up to the promise of the values-based capitalism Jim Chalmers has imagined is possible in his essay. A competitive private sector cannot be achieved by the sort of small government preferred by those who congregate in neoliberalism's strongest bastions like the Business Council of Australia and the Minerals Council of Australia. Instead, the evidence is that when the government sector makes way to increase the private sector's domination of markets and withdraws from providing services and infrastructure direct as a player in its own right, markets lose their incentives to compete by efficiency, and private monopolies emerge to visit a triple penalty on the public: price gouging, low wages, and offshoring of profits. Only the multinationals win in that arrangement. Jim Chalmers' new manifesto for capitalism does not offer Australians a chance to take back some greater share of the market in services and infrastructure and be present as a player that may once again enjoy more of the returns from delivering services to itself. In his essay, he purports to be offering a program to restore competition in capitalism by shifting it away from its neoliberal form and creating new partnerships between the public and private sector. But in reality, he is simply offering a reform which presents little, if any, incentive to shift markets away from corporate greed and irresponsibility and towards public value. If we are to be confident that the public-private investor partnerships Chalmers aspires to will deliver both the values of Australians and the value expected by corporates, more muscle will be needed in the form of public sector participation and ownership alongside these public-private partnerships, because there is no evidence that the corporate sector has a will to cooperate to the extent necessary, especially in the care sector. Corporations are likely to take the Treasurer up on his invitation to co-invest with the government because it will reduce their risk. But when it comes to efficiently delivering good, affordable services and fairly sharing the returns, it will be another story. This is plain from the findings of royal commissions such as that on aged care, where the commissioners found that private providers have much worse quality outcomes than government and not-for-profit providers. In effect, the increasingly private composition of the market has placed further pressure on quality and safety in aged care. Corporate reluctance to share markets with the government sector is also plain from the reaction to the Chalmers essay from those residing at the less altruistic end of the business sector, the end which does not want to see governments spending taxpayer funds directly on taxpayers and is still insisting, after all its glaring failures, that the private sector does it better, and that it should therefore continue to suppress public sector spending and corral handouts of public funds towards private ventures. For this end of the business world, the end that persists in the suggestion that our funds are safer with them than with us, partnership with government and the Australian public does not mean cooperation and increased competition. It means more of the same favours to business. For the newly elected business-focused member of Federal Parliament, Allegra Spender, for instance, it means the government should be fixing itself, not capitalism. It should be relaxing the handbrake on business, introducing more favourable tax and contractual arrangements for them, and asking not just what businesses can do for government, but what government can do for business. There's not much of an indication of a will to cooperate there, certainly not in the way the Treasurer may have hoped. Chalmers published his essay on the 1st of February 2023, and it took respondents like Spender, that are strongly supportive of business, less than a week to reject his approaches out of hand, incapable as they were of seeing anything in the obvious decline of the economy that might have been their fault, or the fault of Conservative governments who structured markets so heavily in their favour. So there may be something wistfully utopian about Chalmers' faith that markets built in partnership through the efforts of business, labour and government are still the best mechanism we have to efficiently and effectively direct resources. It is far more likely that markets built in strong competition are the best mechanism for efficient resource use, particularly in the oligopolistic market structures we now have in Australia, courtesy of neoliberalism. Nevertheless, his idealism does not seem to have blinded him to the need to reshape markets. He rightly observes that the considered and efficient markets he wants were not what the old model delivered. He probably means they were not what neoliberal capitalism delivered, although he might mean that Keynesian economics didn't deliver them either. So it's difficult to know where Chalmers thinks the evidence might reside that suggests partnership markets of the kind he has championed are winners for public value. Suffice to say, the evidence isn't there to support a conclusion that this new model of a values-based capitalism that will rely on fair and honourable partnerships between business and governments has any greater capacity than the old models to deliver public value. In the absence of such evidence, it would be best to build as much tough competition back into the market as possible. This strongly implies that a different focus should be brought to bear on how the national competition policy might be remade so that it is fit to support the sort of collaboration and co-investment necessary for efficient allocation of resources and a reduction of inequality. The national competition policy was designed in the early 1990s to make room for greater private involvement in public services and markets by levelling purported playing field imbalances between the public and the private sectors. It was built on a premise that the private sector was suffering barriers to entry to new markets because of advantages ostensibly enjoyed by the public sector in ownership of natural monopolies and critical infrastructure. At its inception, the policy was meant to merely level the playing field and ensure access to infrastructure by the private sector on fair terms. It wasn't meant to eject the public entirely from ownership or a share of ownership in services or infrastructure. It was meant to usher in a period of improved capacity for both the public and private sectors to compete. And by that means, it was meant to result in assurances for Australians that goods and services would be delivered at the lowest long-run cost. As it played out, though, once the Howard government came to power, privatisation programs premised on an idea, ultimately proven to be baseless, that the private sector operating in free markets is naturally more efficient than the public sector operating in the same markets, functioned to withdraw the public sector far more than it should have from being a player in the levelled field. Instead of services being privatised in such a way as to increase competition, more and more was simply sold off, and sometimes as private monopolies, no less. Often they were sold for far less than their value and with contract conditions which actually introduced huge barriers to the public sector in competition. It was a raid on public assets and income streams on a grand scale, facilitated by governments for the purpose of reducing competition for the private sector rather than increasing it. To correct this, it will not be enough to rely on partnerships between business, labour and government as Chalmers prefers. The damage is now too significant for such a softly solution. We now have an economy controlled by oligopolies, particularly in banking, the media, mining, airlines, airports, ports, electricity generation and transmission, roads and transport, health and aged care, laboratories, and vital databases. And some state governments are looking to expand the sell-offs, most notably the New South Wales government, which now wishes to privatise Sydney Water. Chalmers is of the view that if we are to have a prosperous future, we need an inclusive economy, by which he means we need to draw on all the nation's talents. He's not alone in this view. For instance, the Australian National Outlook 2019, a consortium of the CSIRO, National Australia Bank, and 20 other participating agencies, including 3 universities, peak not-for-profit NGOs, a range of major corporations and funds managers, and the Australian Stock Exchange, strongly supports this view. So it should be expected that there will be little dispute from the private sector about the benefits of an inclusive economy. However, Chalmers assumes we can attain the necessary inclusion if governments and investors can, as he says, be partners, not protagonists. He probably meant to type antagonists there, since the use of protagonist is plainly misplaced. But the evidence would suggest that when it comes to creating competition, we need somewhat more antagonism than less, and particularly more of the antagonism that can only come from having a big, strong, publicly owned competitor actively working to maximise public value in a well-regulated, fair market. Nothing less than the fear of an able and efficient publicly owned competitor is likely to increase the private sector's focus on national values rather than the single aim of private profit. Without the constraint of the necessary competition from an efficient public sector, the private sector, particularly in less well-regulated forms of neoliberal capitalism, will be structurally geared not to promote social purposes but to embed inequality. Neoliberalism thrives on inequality, so it will be incentivised to continue embedding it unless strong counter-incentives can be simultaneously and firmly embedded throughout our market structures. This means bigger government and the courage to stand up for it. Chalmers wants to be a leader, but unless he exhibits the courage to match the near-complete takeover of our markets by the private sector with competitive participation by the public sector on behalf of the taxpayers, well, Chalmers and the partnerships he wants will be swept aside like feathers. Australia is home to a large number of adherents to the myth that the private sector, operating in free or at least very lightly regulated markets, will inevitably be more efficient than publicly funded competitors operating in the same markets. And for more than 2 decades, these myth-makers have sought to complete their takeover of markets in social services and national infrastructure assets. So it should be no surprise that in 2015, when the National Competition Policy was reviewed, it did not result in any reform. With the benefit of 2 decades of experience about the parts of the policy that had not worked well, the reviewers should have picked up the obvious, that the policy was not being implemented as per its original intention of establishing efficient service delivery through fair competition between the public and private sector on a level playing field. But they did not pick this up. Instead, they made recommendations that set the policy up not just to repeat, but to widen the original mistakes by approving expansion of the sort of public assets and services that should be exposed to privatisation. This disregarded the obvious negative impacts on consumers arising from the way the policy had been implemented, with the playing field so grossly tilted in the private sector's favour. But those negative consequences didn't just arise because the policy was badly applied. They were bound to happen because the policy itself was built on a poor understanding of and commitment to what was in the long-term national interest. Mistakes arose in part because the policy was built on short-sighted assumptions held by vested interests, assumptions that the public sector contributions to the economy are inherently negative or anti-competitive and comparatively incapable of delivering social value, when in fact the government sector, especially in banking, should never have had its participation restricted if we want the economy to grow. And restricting that participation solves nothing about uncompetitive problems in either the government sector or the private sector. Today, adherents to the National Competition Policy have a blind spot about its weaknesses. Andrew Leigh, for instance, sees that it has pitfalls in the degree to which it supports privatisation. Beware of privatised monopolies, he cautioned in a speech in October 2022, reviewing the successes of the policy. But this did not imply that lessons learned included much in the way of regret for the loss of public ownership and a large part of the taxpayer's stake in the markets that supply social services and infrastructure. there was a lot in the national competition policy that was good for Australia, but excessive privatisation that removed the public sector as a competitor was not one of those good things. In effect, the partly misconceived and sadly misapplied national competition policy is the single biggest cause of the harms wrought on our economy by neoliberalism in Australia. The policy became and remains the cradle of neoliberalism, one around which our governments still sing a lullaby that smooths the way for the next wave of poorly regulated and exploitative capitalism instead of well-regulated, efficient capitalism, the sort that can only come from full exposure to competition. The national competition policy has put Australia's economy to sleep. And because it wasn't complemented by decent competition law and a fully independent Competition and Consumer Commission, in other words, because regulation was weak, Australia ended up selling off assets and services for far less than they were worth in the long run. It also eventually stopped programs of genuine efficiency in the government sector, and everyone suffered price rises for the things we sold into the hands of companies that did not and probably will not support the national interest. No wonder Chalmers thinks that efficient markets were not what the old model of neoliberalism delivered. Dr. Lee has said he will review the national competition policy to make a zippier economy. But the extent to which the sort of reforms he has in mind might help restore competition is uncertain. Lee recognises that maintaining competition in Australia's economy is a dynamic rather than static exercise. He also sees that while the national competition policy reforms were well suited to the challenges Australia faced in the early 1990s, such as the need to reform government businesses, we face new challenges in the 2020s, which suggest that the focus of competition reform in our era should be on the private sector, where there are real concerns about Australia's economic dynamism. This places Lee in an opposite position to those from the world of business who rose to respond to the Chalmers essay, going into full denial mode about their share of fault in the decline of Australia's economy. So it will be interesting to see if and how these antagonists might settle the country into a more cooperative, zippier economy. From the perspective of taxpayers, consumers and the Australian community, arguments about which sector of the market, private or public, needs to clean up its act more are at best the arcane self-indulgence of commercial and political interests, and at worst a blame game at the continuing expense of Australians. Neither side makes space for the Australian community to once again command a share of the market sufficient to ensure that social services and infrastructure deliver what they truly value, reliably and at an affordable price. Neither side seems to have acknowledged that restriction of participation by the taxpayer-owned sector in the economy is a continuation of the exclusive economy they both say they don't want. However, it is somewhat encouraging that Dr. Lee at least has discerned that the necessary reforms will require not just what he calls cooperation and an alignment of incentives, presumably for public and private participants in markets, but also conversations about our vision for the nation. There are hints here that he might want to swing the conversation back to the topic of the values of the nation and what we want it to become, and that he understands the primacy of that consideration in the design of our economy. There are signs that at least one minister might be contemplating an idea that if the economy is to be remade for people, then the government would do well to seek out their values and what they want for the future of the nation. If that is indeed what Lee is considering, I would suggest he's on the right track about the sort of conversation with Australians that will be necessary to draw them into the centre of their economy. It is difficult to know if Treasurer Chalmers would be willing to consider taking a step back for a year or so to consider the design of the economy from the point of view of the reason for that economy, Australians. In his eagerness for leadership, he has jumped to solutions that focus heavily on making the private sector work better for social purposes. This is a good start, and certainly a better offer than Australians have had for a long time. But unless these solutions are implemented alongside a program to address the deep weakness within the national competition policy, the weakness which makes it a tool of exclusion of the public from competitive participation in their own economy, then the solutions Chalmers has offered may well fail before they start. Incentives within the current national competition policy are not designed to align the objectives of business with those of Australians. Instead, they're very likely to result in less opportunity for the inclusive economy that can only come from participation in the market by all potential partners, including taxpayers, consumers, and an efficient government sector operating democratically on their behalf. An economy which does not accord the people of Australia a decent share of returns for investment of their funds is not inclusive. If there is a problem with the Chalmers essay and the responses it has generated from the business sector, then from the point of view of the Australian community, it's not really about which sector has been more at fault in our economic decline and which sector needs to be fixed. It's more about a failure to define the purposes for which we might design our next economy. Chalmers is offering a vision for capitalism, but not a vision for the nation. These are very different things, and if the former is built without consideration of the latter, we are very likely to be following a path to a social, environmental, and economic destination we do not prefer. In the broader sense, if the economy is built without consideration of the agreed direction of the nation and the values we wish to hold and exhibit as we track towards a better future, then we are likely to be the victim of an economy controlled by the strongest corporations, especially if we build nothing to shield ourselves from continuation of the predatory behaviours of neoliberalism. If Drs. Chalmers and Lee prefer to build a new capitalism by co-investing with businesses, and if they prefer to continue with exclusion of investment in direct service delivery and infrastructure owned by the state on behalf of Australians for the benefit of Australians, this cannot be considered a capitalism which puts people front and centre, let alone as political equals in an inclusive economy. A values-based capitalism will require the government to put Australians first, not business. To be more specific, the two doctors should put the values of Australians well before the values of business and capitalism. And in the same way that the Treasurer might take a step back to consider the values of Australians before he attempts to build an economy capable of delivering well-being, business might also consider taking a step back to look at what Australians value. If business leaders are as well-intentioned as Chalmers insists they are, if they care about the nation as well as their own bottom line, then they should have no need to hesitate in participation in programs which seek out the points of alignment between their objectives and national values. That said, the negative reaction by businesses to the Chalmers essay suggests that the private sector is not yet ready for the necessary introspection about its role in the decline of our economy and the need for all players to change. For its part, business leaders like Allegra Spender are sticking by their claim that they are already doing enough to support an agenda of making the country better, making our workplaces more inclusive, helping to share prosperity, and making a positive contribution to our communities. Spender claims that this is demonstrated by the business community's endorsement of paid domestic violence leave and the Respect at Work bill. These concessions are appreciated, but they do not amount to evidence that business is willing to share with Australians the prosperity it enjoys for investment of their funds. In other words, they're not evidence of a solid desire for inclusion and commitment to equality. On the contrary, the evidence points the other way. For instance, during the neoliberal decades, the national income we all work hard to generate grew to 4 times the size it was in 1975. But in 1975, 62% of that pie of national income went to Australians in wages, and the share that went to corporate profits was only 17%. Since then, shares of wealth have steadily and significantly reversed, so that in 2021, only 51% of the pie went to Australians in wages, and the share that went to corporate profits had almost doubled to 30%. The corporate sector gorged on the growth built by Australians, and inequality is now significantly larger than it was before the national competition policy was implemented in such a way as to stack the odds against poorer Australians. This is obviously a less inclusive economy, and it is one that is not likely to be made more inclusive by the few concessions businesses may be prepared to countenance. If this trend of exclusion is not corrected, it will actually build in spirals of slower growth and economic contraction. Inequality will do that simply because it means too many of us have too little to spend, which dampens demand, which then results in job loss, and round it goes in a downward spiral. No doubt, the last thing business wants is a bigger, more competitive public sector. For business, the prospect of greater participation by state-owned enterprises and larger annual increases in expenditure on services by the public sector will threaten the wage control achieved by the private sector over recent decades and lower their excessive profits. But if we truly wish to build a capitalist economy that is for people and delivers what they value, the two doctors currently running the Treasury will need to add something to their strategy of cooperation and co-investment with the private sector. They will need to assert the values of Australians before the values of capitalism. Their first opportunity to do that is likely to arise if they honour the commitment to have a conversation with the Australian people about how we pay for the services that they need and deserve and have a right to expect. Chalmers clearly wants an inclusive economy, but that is not something we can establish without a much broader and more inclusive conversation than the one he seems to be considering. If all we are offered in that conversation is the prospect of co-investing with the private sector, that sector's record of performance means we will be extremely unlikely to build anything other than an economy where too many of us have too little to spend on what we really need. But it is possible for Australians to have a conversation that will result in the design of a people-centred economy. With the aid of a national integrated long-term planning and reporting process, everyday Australians can participate in a meaningful exchange of ideas with the Treasurer. Australian Community Futures Planning has developed such a process and is already accessible by all Australians. The Treasurer can use it too. It offers an orderly means by which Australians can define the objectives of their economy and develop their preferred paths towards it. In the next part of this essay, I'll discuss how that national integrated planning and reporting process can be used to broaden the parameters of a conversation with Australia's Treasurer about the economy they want to build. A people-centred form of capitalism is a real possibility, but it can only arise from ongoing conversations about the best way to build fairness back into the economy so that Australians have an equal chance of establishing the well-being they need.
That was the third of 4 parts in this talk in reply to Jim Chalmers. For more information about a national integrated planning and reporting process that can help Australians have inclusive conversations with the Treasurer about their preferred economy, visit the Australian Community Futures Planning website at www.austintegrated-planning-and-reporting. In the next and final part of this talk, Bronwyn looks at how the government can have conversations with Australians about the principle of fairness in taxation and distribution of national wealth, and how these conversations will be crucial to the government's chances of building the fair and inclusive economy we need.